Okay, we're going to talk about the Romantic Manifesto. We're doing more quotes. This is like part 4, I think, of Quotes of Ayn Rand. And we'll talk about Romantic Manifesto, which is her best book. It's really a book about writing. How do you write a great book? What are the great books that have been written? And also about philosophy. She describes her own style as romantic realism. So that's why the name Romantic Manifesto, to promote romantic realism as a style of writing. She talks about the 1800s just being the most magnificent time for literature, culture, and it really was. Because she said it had an Aristotelian sense of life. The people were intoxicated with freedom. In the 1800s, the monarchy was crumbling, and she felt it was also good, in her opinion, that the church was weaker. She said that there was not as much of a straitjacket of cultural bromides. She thinks that Shakespeare was a great writer as far as he could go with the naturalism style. The naturalism style says man is doomed to accept his fate, so she doesn't like it. But she said the best you could do with it is Shakespeare, something like Hamlet, for example. But she thinks it's impossible, really, to make top quality literature when you're using naturalism style. She says there's just too much emphasis on fate. She also says she does not like Buddhism. She says Buddhism is not a sense of life. Buddhism is a sense of doom. She's not very sympathetic to non-Western cultures, okay? When she was asked, what did she think of Christopher Columbus and Western man taking over the North America, she said they should. Why should the place be left to a bunch of savages? That's what she thought of the native people of America. I'm just telling you, that's her opinion, okay? She said the 1800s was a time of joyous romanticism, a triumphant sense of life with writers like, Victor Hugo and characters like Jean Valjean. They're magnificent, she says. She's very Christian in her choice of literature. I've talked about that before, but, best book ever, Quo Vadis by Henry Sienkiewicz. Best novelist ever, Victor Hugo, with books like Jean Valjean, Les Miserables, Dostoevsky, Brothers Karamazov. She says literature went through several phases, and classicism is where man was largely a victim of his fate, but he did have some volition in terms of external problems, like deciding whether to fight or not to fight. But she says that those are really kind of simplistic books, stuff like Walter Scott, The Scottishman, and Alexander Dumas. Man could be noble and he could be brave, but there's not a lot of internal insight, And Schopenhauer would agree with that. Schopenhauer would say the best books are when you follow the character's thoughts and you can relate to them. There's sort of internal drama as well as the external drama. Now I must fight, the people invading our land. Okay, so she says, the Count of Monte Cristo is a little bit vulgar. It's about revenge and kind of simplistic in its thinking. There's no conscience or morals. She says the feeling upon reading Victor Hugo is like you're walking into a cathedral. It's spectacular. Even though Victor Hugo himself really wasn't that strong of a philosopher or a social thinker, he could write a story that was just magnificent. His big characters were really big, and his bad characters were really bad. There was a strong contrast between them that was great. She says reading Dostoevsky is like walking into a chamber of horrors, but with a strong, smart guide. She hated Tolstoy. She says reading Tolstoy is like looking into your neighbor's yard and it's full of dog poo. She says Tolstoy is evil. She says that Anna Karenina is the most evil high literature novel ever written, that a person can't do anything and they end up having to commit suicide because they just don't have any choices. She says, what a disgusting, evil view of life. And I can tell you, if you read about Tolstoy, the more you read about him, the more you'll hate him. He was a bad guy. He really was. He was. The reason he became a famous writer is he could describe things and you feel like you were there. His descriptions were perfect. But he has no moral message to share with you. He's a scumbag. Okay. Let's see, what else? The 1800s was a big improvement on Dumas and Walter Scott and the other ones, just because man now was written with more conscience, more soul. And again, I always find that funny. She talks about the soul, and then she calls herself an atheist. You learn more biology, biochemistry, you won't be an atheist anymore. She loved The Scarlet Letter as well, which is really a deep Christian book. And the thought that go into that, basically in Scarlet Letter, the guy who was who committed adultery, the priest, was actually a good man. And the husband who actually came along later was actually a bad man. But that's actually a great book, Scarlet Letter. At first I wasn't so sure, but when I went back and reread it, it was a magnificent book. Okay, let's see. What else here does she talk about? Oh, and of course, you know, she hates Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant is like the opposite of Ayn Rand. She's all about reason, reason, reason. You can figure out everything. Immanuel Kant was like, you can't figure out anything. You can't trust your senses. So that whole business of Immanuel Kant, to me, it's like the Greek Pyrrhonian skeptics were sort of transferred into Immanuel Kant, then into David Hume, and then into a lot of modernism where nobody knows anything. There's nothing you can do. Sort of like that Indian Mayan concept of nobody can know reality. It's all BS, and it turns you into wimp. And Bertrand Russell was kind of like that too. That kind of thinking leads you nowhere. All right, let's see what else. Her idea of a great book is where there's a heroic male lead character. Okay, she was very much into the heroic man. Okay, and I don't recall her ever talking that much about a heroic woman. She talks about a heroic man. And I already told you she says the three best philosophers were the three A's, Aristotle, Aquinas, and Ayn herself. Okay, she did not like Plato because Plato was the opposite, she felt, of Aristotle. I would agree. Plato was collectivist. Plato was so pissed off that Athens lost to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War that he really admired Sparta too much, even though the Spartans were kind of brutal compared to the Athenians. And they're stupid, okay? They don't read and write books or anything. Nothing culturally great came out of Sparta, okay? And Plato wanted the citizens to be kind of owned like farm animals, and, you know, the best man forced to breed to the best woman to produce a warrior, to produce a scholar. He really wanted eugenic and selective breeding of humans. She says all progress is the work of individuals. Okay. Romanticism, basically, in her terms, is heroic Christian literature. Okay, let's see. What else? Romanticists are champions of values and therefore of volition. Reason is the source of volition. She says, young men groping blindly for a value system should choose romantic realism and capitalism instead of socialism. Socialism is destruction. Okay. She says the best economy, of course, is laissez-faire capitalism. She says a man cannot write well without a good personal philosophy. Except for the exceptions, there is no good art or literature nowadays. She's right, and it's gotten worse in our time. It was like nothing good comes out of Hollywood. Hollywood's not capable of making anything good. I had heard somebody say about 20 years ago, when anything good comes out of Hollywood or on TV, it's by accident, okay, or it's somehow snuck through, okay. She said, disasters can happen subconsciously, but a cure cannot. It must be a conscious choice. Romanticism, you know, means that a man is able to choose his path, to follow his goals, to make things happen, that he has a strong effect on the outcome of his life. He's not just a helpless victim to fate. And she hates naturalism, where the characters are often freaks or losers, and they're just boring. Things happen randomly. There's not like a purpose to it. So, like, what's the point of reading it if it doesn't make sense? Let's see. She says the reason that rogue characters are popular in romantic fiction is because people like their assertiveness. She said morally good characters sometimes are hard to write because they're often portrayed with too much unrealistic altruism, and they become like socialism. She says, for example, Alyosha in Brothers Karamazov was not as well written as one would hope, and that Jean Valjean in Les Mis was a little bit too much of an abstraction. There's some truth in that. Alyosha, I could totally relate to Alyosha, though. I could totally see people being like him. Jean Valjean, yeah, I liked him, but there was something abstract about him. He was like the goodness of the French people as much as he was an individual. Okay. And, you know, there it is again. She says, Anna Karenina is the most evil book in high literature. Okay. She said Fyodor Dostoevsky was great at portraying his evil characters, but not so good at portraying heroes like Alyosha, and, you know, I would add the Prince Mishkin in his book The Idiot. That was a good book too. So to write well in romantic literature, you have to have good storytelling, imagination, ingenuity, and a sense of drama. Okay, let's see. She said volitional man didn't really appear in literature, you know, conscious volitional man, until the 1800s. Okay. She also talks about other types of art. She says when a person changes their preferences in philosophy and behavior, they will also change their preferences in music. For example, a scholar will like Bach, okay? Somebody in other things like, some of the bad rock and roll, uh, drug abuser will like that sort of stuff, like Woodstock or Pink Floyd, okay? She says beat music is a narcotic for mediocre minds. I'd agree with that. Whenever I hear beat music, I always think the person's stupid because with beat music, you want to turn your brain off. And I hate it because I sometimes lift weights. I'll go lift weights. And the young guys almost always are listening to beat music, which is like stupid. You can't have a thought in your mind with boom, boom, boom. So it makes you dumb. If you're listening to that all the time, it means your brain is not working. Whereas myself, I'm always thinking about something. And you can listen to music with a melody and you can hear the words and you hear the story and that conjures up thoughts. But at least you can understand the words. When you can't understand the words and it's just bump, 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 that makes you dumb. Too much of that lowers your IQ. I know that I can't think at all when somebody's listening to beat music. She says art, including literature, is a barometer of culture. She doesn't like thrillers much. She says they're like kindergarten compared with romantic literature. I don't either. I don't tend to like thrillers or detective stuff too much. Let's see. She also talked that when the age is doing poorly, it's because there's a cowardice and a lack of responsibility amongst the intellectuals. And yeah, she said Hugo had a great sense of life in his books, but he's not much of a thinker. I'd agree with that, even though you can be a literary genius and not be much of a thinker. It's actually true. Victor Hugo's a good, perfect example. Romantic literature can help teach children morals by providing good role models. Yes, literature can provide good role models, and that's important. She's kind of unfair to the Middle Ages, calling it backward and stuff, and too many gargoyles. The Middle Ages are the reason why the Renaissance only happened in Europe. Okay, I've talked about that in other lectures. A lot of big things, good things happened in the Middle Ages. Dramatic improvements in farming. A lot more scholarship than she gives it credit for. It's where all the universities came from. All right, heroes inspire people, and courage is contagious, but so is cowardice. She says the vulgar moderns are neo-barbarians. I'd agree with that too. So anyways, that's it for Ayn Rand today. Hope you found that helpful.